I don't know if you were able to listen to Olha there talking
Yes, I did.
about the scale of the evidence of atrocities which is emerging.
Yes, I did. I heard all of it.
And what did you make of what you hear?
Well, it's the developing story of crimes, but we shouldn't think that crimes are only a recent event. From the very start of this invasion, attack, and war, it was an aggressive war that should be tried, but for technical reasons, it may be difficult to try it at the moment. And within that unlawful act of aggression, there have from the very beginning been war crimes. It may be that the crimes are simply getting worse or evidence about them is becoming more graphic, but there have been crimes from the beginning. And there's a very great deal of available evidence, including evidence coming from journalists and people such as Ola, to whom you spoke.
When you hear the description of some of the incidents which Olha was talking about, rapes of women, children, men, we've seen these images of people who were killed with their hands tied behind their backs. Someone who has had a great deal of experience of these things, is this the sort of thing that happens in war, or do you think that there is a particularly high level of brutality here?
Not really easy to express a comparative judgment, but you're right in the first part of your question. These things happen in war, all of the things that you described. And so we shouldn't, sadly, be surprised about hearing from them. What we should do is be quite sure that a record of great clarity is left of what has happened. Whether or not there are ever any war crimes trials, we should leave a record, a full record of what has happened, because it's that record that will work for the future benefit of the Ukrainian people and indeed for the benefit of all of us. Because implied in your question is that we, the public, need to understand what we, the public, are capable to do when we are led not just into mischief, but into absolute wickedness by a government in the way that Russia has led its people, who would otherwise no doubt lead perfectly good and innocent lives. We need to understand that that can happen if badly led, and that record needs to be left, preferably involving war crimes trials, but that may never happen.
You say that may never happen. I was just going to ask you about the process from here, because Olha was talking about how she has logged something like 6,000 different incidents. There is the prosecutor in Ukraine who is overseeing a process. We know that there are international teams who are also working to try to at least advise the Ukrainian government. What do you know about the process of trying to gather evidence and what happens from there in order to try and bring people to justice?
If you start at the far end of that, unless you have a mechanism for trials in absentia, you have to get the defendant before the relevant court, the international court, in particular the International Criminal Court. If you can't do that, there will be no war crimes trial. That's one of the reasons I say that leaving a reliable record is actually as important or almost more important than getting to a trial itself. And also leaving a record quickly as important. One of the problems with war crimes trials of the former Yugoslavia has been that they've taken so long to reach conclusion that uneven, uncertain conclusions have been left lingering in the public's mind rather than the very clear conclusion that should have been left, for example, about Serbian responsibility and Republic of Serbian responsibilities for Kosovo. So that's the end point. The midpoint is, how do you collect the evidence? Well, with an eye to both leaving a good record and to facing modern, not old-fashioned judges, pretty well any evidence is likely to be admissible in modern courts. Obviously, you need to have a record of who took the evidence or who took the photograph or who saw this or that, preferably reduced into either writing and or into video and stored somewhere safely so that if anybody ever wants to challenge the integrity of the evidence, they can. But you should also start with the assumption. Sometimes lawyers enjoy not making this assumption, that if a witness to events says something happened, then it happened, unless there's an actually good reason to doubt that it happened. And there's an absolute mass of evidence. And her 6,000 cases are presumably being launched in the domestic Ukraine court. And whether they identify individual Russian offenders, I don't know. We also know, and this is very important, that Ukraine is checking whether its own troops have committed offences. Of course, some will have committed offences. That always happens in war. And it's immensely to the credit of Ukraine that it started publicly the process of investigating any crimes committed by its own people.
But are you really saying, though, that despite so much evidence of so many appalling atrocities, you don't think that any senior Russian commanders, let alone President Putin himself, will ever be forced to face trial for this?
I can't express an opinion on whether it will or won't happen, but you have to recognize, and your listeners and viewers have to recognize, that there is no effective world order for international justice. It's very partial. And unless, let's suppose that an indictment is issued against General XYZ from Russia, and if he chooses to stay in Russia, how are you going to get him out? Now, certainly Ukraine can't get him out. It doesn't have a police force who can fly in and sort of find him and bring him out. That's not going to happen. So it's down to the international community in some way or another. And possibly the next big test for the community will be whether it will use its muscle, some of the muscle it's now found, for example, in the sanctions it's imposed, to make international justice more effective than it was over the last 30 years. Because remember, despite people like Mladic and Karadzic, who your viewers may know or remember or can be informed were important potential defendants at the Yugoslav tribunal, it took decades for them to be produced, and then rather by chance. And how much, and it was left somehow to the prosecutor at the court to manage a way of getting them arrested, rather unrealistic. It should have been the international community that applied pressure to Serbia, because we all knew Serbia had them in its control, and it should have sanctioned Serbia in such a way that Serbia would have handed them over earlier.
So we had a special tribunal set up for Yugoslavia. Could you not have a special tribunal set up for what has happened in Ukraine, a tribunal with the backing of the international community, which could ensure that people who are responsible for some of the appalling atrocities that we've seen face justice?
Well, then the same problem arises. If you can't get them to the place where the court sits, then it's not going to be effective, any more effective than the Yugoslav tribunal was in its early days. Plus the fact that there is already an existing mechanism, the International Criminal Court. And if you set up another one, sort of similar but slightly different, you're in one way or another acknowledging the shortcomings of the present order. Far, far more important that the present order should be corrected, made more effective. And for example, a very important step that should be taken is to kick Russia off the Security Council or withdraw its veto, or in some other way stop it having the power of to stop itself being tried. That power, just think about this, you and your viewers and listeners, that power is the equivalent of Hitler being given the veto power in 1944 to say who would be tried at Nuremberg in 1946. So that's one way that the present system can be improved. Saying that the present system is a bit broken or incomplete doesn't mean to say we shouldn't put all our effort into ensuring that it's improved. And certainly one of the ways it can be improved is by getting rid of Russia's veto, and then it could stand trial, by the way, for the crime of aggression. It could be made to stand trial for that. And another way is to ensure, after this conflict ends, that identified Russian potential defendants are handed over by Russia, and that might be something that the international community would be more willing to do now, by way of really severe sanctions on Russia, assuming Russia's regime doesn't change and they're willing to hand the people over. And maybe the international community will be more willing to do that, because this event, which has brought us to the brink, it is thought, of nuclear disaster, nuclear warfare disaster, has made it wake up to the shortcomings of its various systems.
So if you could kick Russia off the UN Security Council, then there would be a chance, perhaps, of bringing him to before the International Criminal Court and putting him on trial.
Well, you could remember, again, only if he's there can he be tried. You'd at least be able to start the process and maybe get an indictment issued for aggression. That is assuming that China wouldn't step in and exercise its veto. These are all very problematic issues. I come back to what I said at the beginning. although it may be very, very important and very desirable, I've never been a victim, so I don't know how desirable, to see offenders brought to justice and sentenced to life imprisonment. Very important. Actually setting a complete definitive record right at the beginning of a conflict or as soon as it is concluded is also absolutely invaluable. Immediately after the Second World War, the Nuremberg trials of the leadership of the Nazis made it quite clear, and it was never thereafter doubted except by just one or two cranks, made it quite clear who the villain was. The villain was Nazi Germany. The good guys were the rest, notwithstanding the individual crimes they may have committed. And that certainty served a huge purpose, a benefit rather, brought huge benefit to all of us because we were able to move forward. Now, once this is over, Ukraine must be left in a position of moral certainty. It is the good guy, and it must have that certainty by whatever mechanism, war crimes trials, or some other mechanism based on evidence. It must be given the certainty of moral goodness in order that it can move forward.
And you were very closely involved in those Yugoslav trials, Slobodan Milosevic and so on. No one at the time of the war thought that characters like that would ever be brought to trial. Do you think that, given what happened there is still a possibility, despite all the difficulties that you've explained so clearly, that Russian commanders, perhaps President Putin, perhaps some of those around him, could ultimately be brought to trial?
Your first point is actually a very important and shrewd one. Nobody expected the leadership to be brought to trial. If they had, Russia would have exercised its veto probably and ensured that the tribunal never came into being. What happened in respect of the leadership of the former Yugoslavia, one way and another, was that regimes did change, as in Serbia, so that Milosevic was handed over. That was a very important event. And so I dare say the same thing just might happen in Russia. But to comment on political likelihoods is not at all within my skill base.
Let me just ask you one final point, because I know that you're very closely involved in this tribunal looking into alleged genocide against the Uyghurs by China. I mean, you've talked throughout this interview about how there's no point in, you can only put someone on trial for war crimes if they can be brought before a court. Don't you have the same problem with this tribunal, which has found that China carried out genocide against the Uyghurs, but of course it has no power to enforce that?
Completely correct. The judgment of the tribunal is clear and the judgment has never been challenged, that the responsibility for what's been happening to the Uyghurs goes right to the top, to President Xi. And maybe he'll never find himself having to face a court or similar to deal with those allegations. But what has been achieved by the tribunal, and by the way, it was achieved by the tribunal of 9 non-specialist people working entirely pro bono on the basis of a mass of evidence, but in less than a year. What has happened there is that a judgment has been left that is now a part of the general narrative, where the government refused to make such a judgment. The British government, unlike one other in particular, completely refuses to say whether genocide has happened or is happening or may happen. Says it has to be dealt with by a judge, knowing that there's no judge who can deal with it. That's why the tribunal came into being and did the task for the judgment, for the country. And just to finish that, the reason the country will not ever make such a judgment is because, particularly about genocide, is because the Genocide Convention and the law about it says as soon as you think genocide is happening, you have to act to stop it immediately.
Sir Geoffrey Nice QC, who led the prosecution of the former Serbian president Slobodan Milosevic and was also, of course, involved in that independent Uyghur tribunal. Great to speak to you. Thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome.